Hello and welcome to Week 1 Presentation 3, Scientific Theory. I'm Dr. Vincenzo Cianato, and scientific theory, a lot of people when they hear the word theory, they have quite frequently a wrong conception of what a theory is. Hopefully through the course of this presentation, you will learn to appreciate the value of what a scientific theory is versus something else. A lot of times you might hear people say, in response to somebody saying something, oh, that's just theory, that is meaningless. Well, frequently, what the person really should say is, that's just hypothetical, or that's just a concept. Whereas, if it actually is a theory, it's something that's generally a little more substantive than something that somebody just says just because they feel it, or it's in their gut. Hopefully, through the course of this presentation, you'll get a better understanding of why that might be true. First off, let's just take a little half a step back and one step forward. In a previous presentation, we discussed how anything that is scientifically studied is not simply philosophical or logical, but also is imbued with empirical tests, meaning it can be measured in some way. Whereas ideology is logic plus faith, and theology is simply faith or just I believe. We talked about this in a previous presentation. Additionally, the scientific study of anything involves looking at patterns and exceptions, where in other words, tries to discover those patterns and looks for the exceptions or the anomalies. Or at least it tries to understand them, if not perfectly explain them. Frequently, they focus on aggregates, which are collections of measurements. It's not simply enough to say poverty causes crime. Okay? You have to go a little deeper than simply saying poverty causes crime, because there's plenty of people who we would characterize as being in poverty that we would not characterize as being criminals per se. Something that is studied scientifically includes attributes which can be described. These are the characteristics or the qualities of something, such as bigoted, married, stupid, ignorant, drunk, whatever. Lastly, when something is studied scientifically, we try to group things into variables, which are simply just a collection of attributes. Examples include occupation, age, income. Why study theory? Well, as the screen says, it is the anchor of all social science. Okay, that's true, but what we mean by that is that some people create theories. They are theoreticians. They literally spend their careers trying to develop theoretical frameworks or paradigms or whatever to explain why something is. The vast majority of people who are, in my case, a criminologist or an economist, we use theory as a tool to help sort of understand or why something is, or develop policies. In my case, I'm much more interested in using theory as a tool for developing policies. I use social science theories because if they're properly rendered, they've been scientifically assessed, studied, and can be validated. And we'll talk about validations in a little bit. While there is no one perfect definition of what a theory is, I have one up on the screen that is very simply laid out, which is essentially a theory is any system of ideas arranged in rational order that produces general principles which increase our understanding and explanations. Let me add to this. When I say any system of ideas, what I'm saying is, or subsumed into that, is the idea that the ideas are empirically measurable. They're tangible. They are real. They're arranged in a rational order. There's your logic. So now we have our empiricism and we have our logic. And when those are combined together in a particular theory, they create general principles or ideas or concepts or statements, really ultimately, which by their organization or their statement increase our understanding and explanation of the natural world around us. There are a number of different characteristics that scientific theories should really or must have. One is that they focus attention on a particular phenomenon. In other words, bad theories say, if you're not feeling well, it's going to cause you to commit a crime. The hell does that mean? Honestly, that is very vague, and what does it really mean? It's not particular enough. It's not definitive enough. Of course, if it gets too definitive, then it becomes useless. Like, for example, I'm recording this at 8:12 p.m., and I can come up with a theory that's the theory of 8:12 p.m., where Dr. Cianato is behind the microphone at the computer. That's totally useless. It's way too particular and irrelevant. It doesn't do anything for us. But now you know what time it is. Anyway, secondly, it should fit the known facts about a particular phenomenon. In other words, this goes back to our definition about a collection of ideas rationally organized. Secondly, scientific theory should fit the known facts about a particular phenomenon. It shouldn't hypothesize. Scientific theories aren't about hypotheses. They are about what happens after you do hypothesize something and you've studied it enough where you feel that you can pronounce a theoretical explanation for what it is or what it isn't. Third, it should contribute to scientific paradigms, or in very rare cases, it should create new paradigms. Number 4, it should provide a way it can be tested or falsified. In other words, a scientific theory must be capable of being falsified. Meaning, it might say, this theory strongly argues X. Well, or for example, what if I put forth a theory that says that little blue men in my head cause me to commit deviant acts? Oh, and by the way, if you cut my head open, they disappear, they're invisible. How do you prove that? You can't disprove or prove that. It's like a government official trying to claim that they've either saved or created, 3 million jobs because of stimulus spending. You can't prove that or disprove it. It's not falsifiable, therefore it's not empirical. Not that that would ever happen. Additionally, scientific theory should establish boundaries and domains by which laws and truth statements can be generalized. Good theories identify what they are particularly trying to explain. A domain is what the explanation falls within. So if it's a poverty-related crime issue, and I don't want to get hung up on that, but that one's an easy one to point to, then obviously it falls under a socio-economic domain, as opposed to psychopathy or bipolar. Obviously that falls under the psychological domain. Grand theories are wide in scope and they try to explain many types of criminal behaviors. And within criminology, there's actually not a lot of grand theories. Most of them are a little more focused than simply blank causes crime, and blank being some big idea. And honestly, like the other thing is, with respect to grand theories, they're that much harder to prove or disprove. So some of us try to shy away from the quote-unquote grand theories. With respect to parsimonious propositions, basically what that says is that it's a simple formulation. In other words, a good theory does not have to be rendered in a 500-page book and for you to read every 500 pages in order for you to understand its propositions and what it's trying to say. Really good theory can be simplified into a page that lays itself out and explains its domain and all the other characteristics that are listed on the screen in front of you. Really good theories have both large scope and parsimony. They explain a lot with few concepts, but they don't necessarily have to be a grand theory when we say large scope. And lastly, the really good theory should enable propositions which can be added or compared to those of other theories. Or, more simply put, it should be comparable. In other words, it should be able to be compared to other scientific theories that are related. In short, good scientific theory should be future-based, trying to be predictive. They should explain why phenomena occur and demonstrate the associations between two or more variables. And they can be predictive once you understand how those variables are related, but they may not necessarily be predictive per se, but the best ones are. Another concept of science, whether it be theories or otherwise, that we need to go over has to do with the trade-off between validity and reliability. We often think of reliability and validity as separate ideas, but in fact they're related to each other. I want to show you two ways you can think about their relationship. One metaphor that I frequently use with my students about the relationship between the two is that of a target. If you think of the center of the target as the concept you are trying to measure, then the more closer you are to that center, the more valid you are. You are measuring what you think you're measuring. Now, imagine a scenario where you are maybe taking a survey or in some way measuring people in some way, and that for each person that you are measuring, you are taking a shot at the target. If you measure the concept perfectly for a person, you are hitting the center of the target. If you don't, you are missing the center. And the more you are off for that person or the group of people, the further you are from the center. Now, the further you are from the center, the less valid you are. However, as we're going to see, the more you are clustered together, the more reliable you are. So there tends to be a trade-off between validity and reliability. Let's take a look and sort of hopefully we'll understand this a little better. Okay. Now you have a figure in front of you that shows 4 different bullseyes. In the first one, you're hitting the target consistently, but you are missing the center of the target. That is, you are consistently and systematically measuring the wrong value for all respondents. This measure is reliable, but it's not valid. That is, it's consistent, but it's wrong. The second shows hits that are randomly spread across the target. You seldom hit the center of the target. On average, you are getting the right answer for the group. In other words, if you were to measure the distance of all those dots to the center, they'd have a nice average, but you're not hitting the center very frequently, so not very good. So in this case, you get a valid group estimate, but you are inconsistent. You can clearly see that reliability is directly related to the variability of your measure, and we'll talk about variability in a later course when we get to stats and stuff. In the third scenario shows a case where your hits are spread across the target and you are consistently missing the center. Your measure in this case is neither reliable nor valid. Finally, we see the perfect Robin Hood scenario. You consistently hit the center of the target and your measure is both reliable and valid. I'm quite convinced you probably never thought of Robin Hood in those terms before, but there you have it. While this particular course primarily focuses on criminological theories, later on we'll talk about organizational theories, but for the next couple weeks we're going to be really focusing on criminological. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how criminological theories are, or how crime is studied and how those theories are developed. Crime is studied through a number of different means. Now, by the way, this is not meant to replace a full semester's methods class. Perhaps some of you have taken methods as an undergraduate where you talked about surveys versus ethnography or field research or what have you, and there's many different methodologies for collecting information and observing things scientifically. This is just a very short overview. One way that crime is studied is personal experience. Of course, when that's the case, we are limited by the researcher's experiences and his or her limited perspective. We sometimes study crime by looking at the studies done by others, which leads sometimes to problems with generalizations and interpretations subject to the influence of social context. In other words, it's not enough to rely on a study that was done 200 years ago to explain something, because there's going to be different contexts, different social economic facts that impact how the researcher interpreted the findings and what kind of information or data they were able to obtain in the first place. A couple other characteristics that's important to appreciate when we're studying crime or criminal issues has to do with objectivity. It's really important that we try to keep an open mind. As you'll see in later presentations about this week and beyond, you're sometimes going to be confronted with things that are presented in a way that maybe don't fit your worldview, and that's totally cool. What's important is that you just simply, at the end of the day, keep an open mind about what you're looking at. And don't discount theories based on exceptional cases. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule. There's not a theory that I'm familiar with where it says this is true everywhere and at all times, the end. Now, there are some theories that, for example, rational choice, which are highly linked to some fundamental perspectives of how humans make decisions regardless of what their environment is, whether they're criminal or not. However, even those have exceptions to the rule. For example, people with mental diseases or defects are always an exception to those kind of theories and what have you. Theories aren't meant to provide easy answers, and don't accept them without reservation. In other words, even theories that I find appealing myself, I take a critical eye to. I don't just accept them at face value. Good theory is linked to reality through research. The last thing I kind of skipped over, because we're going to come back to it later, which is counterfactuals. But counterfactuals are an important part of how crime is studied. Like I said, we're going to come back to that in a future slide, so let's just move on. With respect to organizing criminological theories, there's basically three grand sort of areas that criminological theories attempt to explain. First is law breaking. Ask questions such as, why do people commit crimes? What makes some countries more prone to crime than others, etc. The other categories include lawmaking in reaction to lawbreaking. And under lawmaking, we might ask, why are some facts outlawed while in some countries while others are not? Why do legal acts become illegal over time? Or why do some illegal acts become legal over time? And lastly, with respect to reaction to law breaking, why do police arrest certain offenders and not others? Why are certain laws enforced more stringently than others? Criminologists spend whole careers studying these different questions and then some. Any theory that you want to understand, you should try to appreciate what it says about the following issues. These questions are the organizing principles for any theory and should be employed when analyzing it and comparing it to other theories. For example, what's that theory's basic view of human nature? In other words, are humans predestined to do bad things but when they're controlled? Some theories argue that. Other theories might argue, oh, humans are a blank slate and we get ascribed bad behaviors onto us, maybe through learning or our environment or whatever. Other theories are dependent on the definition of crime being used or what causes crime or what have you. And also some theories particularly lend themselves to particular policies and practices. All good scientific theories address whatever it is they're assessing from one level analysis or another. On the very highest level, you have the macro, which really looks at group differences. And on the micro level, typically it's on the individual. Why does the individual engage? And in between, you have a middle level, which is the meso, which usually is a blend of micro to middle or middle to macro. And there's not a lot of theories that do that, and quite frequently, people who use meso-level analysis are really using particular statistical techniques in order to validate their micro or macro level findings. But to illustrate the difference between micro to macro, micro is at the very smallest. What makes green fish different from the orange fish? And as we go further out, maybe perhaps we're looking at the neighborhood level. And if we go further out, maybe it's several neighborhoods. And if we go further out, we're getting more and more macro as we go. Now we have regional. And obviously the red circle represents the original neighborhood we were looking at. And we go further out, now we see the entire country, or several countries now. Now, what makes one level of analysis micro versus macro? It really depends on what you're comparing it to. A few final thoughts on criminological theory. Crime should be viewed not as a single phenomenon, but as one in which many kinds of behavior occur in different situations and under different conditions. And even though I said this before, I just want to reiterate that no single theory can provide all the explanations or answers to crime or criminality, or in other words, the desire to commit crime. The criminological theory attempts to explain the cause of criminal behavior, not to excuse crime or criminals. Moreover, if this is your first crime or criminology class, or a class that involves criminological theory, it is very frequently the case where students will, when exposed to a theory for the first time, self-reflect and say, oh my God, that's me, that totally explains me. Not every theory can explain everything about us as individuals, and most of them won't, per se. But it's just very natural for us to go, oh, that's me, that explains me. No, not so much. Or it might, but maybe not. We're not usually really good at identifying our theories that explain our own behaviors. Lastly, really good theory connects to practice. As a practitioner who's not a theoretician, as I mentioned earlier, I like theory that I can use to assess the real world around me. Why does police agency A perform this way versus agency B perform a different way? What theories can help explain why the leadership in the one works and the other one doesn't? Good theory helps me do that kind of assessment. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about evaluating a theory to kind of determine, well, do I really care? Is this really valuable to me? What is this doing for me? First off, at the very highest level, when we're evaluating a theory, we have to ask ourselves, do these propositions add up? Do they make sense? Even if they do, does the research that the researcher did, does it really connect with the theory? Sometimes you're going to find that there are certain theories where the person makes a macro claim but actually used micro data, and that's actually a problem. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And what about the weight of the evidence? I mean, suppose somebody did a survey of 100 people in the Bronx. Are you necessarily going to believe it just because they said something was true or false? Look at how they operationalize their terms. Look at how they organize their concepts. All these things are important. A couple simple yes/nos. First off, can the theory be tested? Is it clearly stated? Are there concepts that can be measured? No, forget it. You do not have a scientific theory. We said earlier that scientific theory must be falsifiable to be scientific. Okay, yes, if you can, go on to the next question. Is it empirically supported? Is the theory based on tangible, measurable things that are operationalized and, like I said, when you look at it, does it make sense? If yes, continue on, because you most likely have a scientific theory. If not, stop, because the theory isn't related to anything. Next, you can evaluate it. What about the scope? What about the parsimony? What about the parsimony? Whatever, you know what I'm saying. An important problem that sometimes happens are ecological fallacies. Like I intimated this earlier. Sometimes researchers fall into a trap where they make observations at a very micro level, at aggregated level, and assume that those same relationships exist at the individual level, and that frequently isn't the case. And there are some very well-known theories that are studied very much, even to this day, that have ecological fallacies built inside them. One famous example is strain theory. We're going to actually look at that in a few weeks, so we'll come back to that. But there's an ecological fallacy built within it. Does that mean that the theory is completely nullified? Not per se, but in most cases, yes. Let me give an example of an ecological fallacy. I live in New Orleans, moved here about 1.5 years ago. I really enjoy it. Met a lot of great people, and without a doubt, it's a great place to have a good time. This year I discovered what Mardi Gras is really, or last year I discovered what Mardi Gras is really about, and let me tell you, it's a good time. Great music. If you've never had a king cake, seriously, get yourself one. They are awesome. And of course last year we had a really good football season here, and that was okay. So based on these, you might say, man, New Orleans is a fantastic town. However, most people know New Orleans for some other reasons. I can't tell you how many people in my family said, what? You want to move to New Orleans? That is crazy. Murder capital of the United States by some measures. And, this is a place with generally just a lot of crime. Now, as it turns out, there is a lot of crime in New Orleans. If you look further into the data, though, you'll find that most of that crime, especially the real violent crime that people associate with the city, are in very specific clusters, geographic clusters. So not everywhere and at all times. In fact, most of the city is actually fairly safe, unless you go into those clustered areas. Yeah, I don't know. So I guess what I'm trying to say is to my mom and all those others is that New Orleans mostly isn't what you perceive it to be. You've heard what you've heard, and you've misapplied those acts that happen in particular areas to everybody else. They've made a fallacy, an ecological fallacy. Another aspect of theories that we need to appreciate is the issue of probabilistic causality. Basically, in short, really good theories show the relationship between two or more variables. Maybe they make a causal explanation, X causes Y, or maybe they make a temporal ordering that says X doesn't cause Y, but X always precedes Y, and here's why, here's how come, and here's what it means, etc. And also, really good theories control for the counterfactuals. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but what is a counterfactual? Counterfactual is a process of conditional complaints, blah, blah, blah. Okay. In short, it's the what if. Suppose I made a theory that said A was true. Well, if I want to really demonstrate my belief in the relationship of A to whatever, I'm going to look at the what if B was true, C is true, D is true. And I'm going to try to explore those counterfactuals. And if I find them to be false, then what I have left at the end of the day would be A. Famous example of this put into practice are the Sherlock Holmes books. This is a direct quote. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. Now, what he's saying in a very artistic way is, if you explore the counterfactuals and you find them all to be not supported, then what you have left, even if it's a very rare thing, must be what is. There's a number of different limitations on criminological research. If you read original publications by criminologists, the most common conclusion is that more information is needed. Why? Well, yes, it's true that there's a tradition of saying that, sort of hedging your bets, but also more realistically is that it's very rare we have the full amount of data that we need to actually do the assessments or do the research. Sometimes, for a variety of reasons, there's a problem with the method that was employed, and that might not be the fault of the researcher. Sometimes it's just a function of what cards you're dealt with, given what you're researching, and there's a sort of a rule of thumb that says that at some point something in your research project is going to blow up, and you're going to have to figure out what to do about it at that point. One notorious limitation is overgeneralization, and there's a couple really good examples up here. The last one I'm going to start with because it wasn't actually an overgeneralization by the researchers, it was how their findings were interpreted by the general public. And this is actually going to be discussed in one of your other classes, where the media picked up on this research that said, well, if you have mandatory arrests in domestic violence cases, it reduces recidivism. Well, that's not actually true. It's true if the person has a job, which further research showed, but the media jumped on this, and so did attorney generals across the country, and they made mandatory arrest laws, which they may not have done had they not overinterpreted the initial findings of Sherman and Burke. What they later found out with additional research was mandatory arrests work really well in domestic violence cases when the offender has a full-time job. Other examples that are pretty well known, the Martinson report is a fantastic example where he basically stated nothing works with respect to punishment and what have you, but in fact you have to read the full report, and I don't suggest you do it. It's 1,800 pages. But basically he said some things work under certain circumstances, but no things work for all things for all people at all times. A couple of examples of policy with and without theory. One is the multi-systemic theory, or otherwise the Missouri model, which we're actually going to take a look at in a few weeks hence. Project Ceasefire and Jersey City Experiment I actually have provided for you as optional readings for this week. Bad examples are more well known than the good examples, actually, as it turns out, because some of these are mythologically believed to be true, like 3 strikes. Why not 4? Why not 2? Well, actually, the reason why they chose 3 strikes was because of baseball, and that's a fact. And other countries that don't even have baseball have picked up and started using 3 strikes rules. Scared straight's another fabulous example of a policy that's been adopted since the late 70s, early 80s, and has been shown consistently not to be useful. And the same is true with intensive supervision. One version of intensive supervision are those boot camps. Well, they totally work when the person's in the boot camp, but man, once they go back out and they're hanging out with their old friends who never went to the boot camp, actually, some of the research has shown, and this is true with Scared Straight, that they actually get worse because they have to get their street cred back because they went to boot camp and they were scared straight. But they don't want to be straight in a lot of cases. Well, some cases. Okay, here's a listing of some of the further optional readings. You might want to take a look at some of them. I think the Akers ones are particularly useful for this class. The other ones, the Kennedy one, the Weisberg one, these are examples of specific applications of theory with policy that have been really well done, really well rendered. Next are a few more presentations that are much less dense and much shorter than this one. So this is the longest one for the week. So there you go. Have a good one. Bye.